The year was 1939, and the world was rapidly spiraling into the darkest conflict in human history. Across the Atlantic, the war machine of the Third Reich was moving with a terrifying mechanized speed, while in the Pacific, the Japanese Empire was expanding its grip. Yet, the United States military was startlingly unprepared. Ranked 19th in the world in terms of sheer size, the American armed forces were essentially a peacetime constabulary, equipped with weapons and doctrines that had barely evolved since the trenches of the First World War. But as the inevitability of American involvement became brutally clear, a monumental awakening was required. The United States did not just need to build an army, it needed to build the arsenal of democracy. This is the story of an industrial miracle, a time when a sleeping giant awoke and achieved the impossible, transforming civilian factories into wartime powerhouses overnight. Specifically, it is the story of how American industry managed to mass-produce millions of small arms, turning complex, expensive, and meticulously machined weapons into simplified, stamped, and rapidly assembled instruments of liberation. To understand the sheer scale of this industrial race, we must first look at one of the most iconic firearms of the 20th century, the Thompson Submachine Gun. In the years leading up to the war, the Thompson, famously known as the Tommy gun, was a weapon of infamy rather than military standard issue. Designed by Brigadier General John T. Thompson during the waning days of World War I, it was originally intended to be a trench broom, a handheld automatic weapon capable of sweeping enemy positions clear. However, the war ended before it could see service, leaving the Auto-Ordnance Corporation with a brilliant but incredibly expensive weapon and no military buyers. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the Thompson found its way into the hands of law enforcement and, notoriously, Prohibition-era gangsters. The classic model, the M1 was a masterpiece of old-world gunsmithing. It featured a beautifully blued finish, a finned barrel for cooling, an intricate adjustable Lyman rear sight, and a complex friction-delayed blowback operating system known as the Blishlock. But this craftsmanship came at a steep price. A single Thompson cost over $200 in an era when an automobile could be purchased for $400. It required extensive machining, skilled labor, and high-quality steel. It was, simply put, a peacetime luxury item, not a mass-production weapon of war. When the British began purchasing Thompsons in 1940, to replace the weapons lost at Dunkirk, and when the United States officially entered the war after Pearl Harbor in 1941, the demand for submachine guns skyrocketed from mere thousands to hundreds of thousands. The military desperately needed automatic firepower for paratroopers, tank crews, and infantry squad leaders. The Auto-Ordnance Corporation, which did not even own its own manufacturing plant at the time, was utterly incapable of meeting this demand. They contracted with Savage Arms, a company with the industrial floor space and expertise required. But even with Savage operating at maximum capacity, the M1928 design was too slow and too expensive to produce. The American industrial genius did not just lie in working harder. It lay in working smarter. To mass-produce the Thompson overnight, the weapon had to be radically simplified. The engineers at Savage and Auto-Ordnance took a merciless approach to the elegant Tommy gun. The first thing to go was the complex Blishlock. Engineers realized that the heavy bolt of the weapon was entirely sufficient to operate on a simple blowback principle, relying solely on the weight of the bolt and the tension of the recoil spring to keep the breech closed until chamber pressures dropped to safe levels. By eliminating the H-shaped bronze blishlock, they removed a highly intricate component that required precise machining. Next, they targeted the exterior. The iconic cooling fins on the barrel, which required extensive lathe work, were entirely eliminated, leaving a smooth, heavy barrel that was infinitely faster to manufacture. The intricate cuts compensator at the muzzle was replaced by a simple front sight ring. The beautiful but fragile adjustable rear sight was swapped for a rudimentary piece of L-shaped stamped steel, welded directly to the receiver. The charging handle, previously located in a slotted channel on the top of the receiver, was moved to the side, greatly simplifying the milling process of the receiver itself. This drastic evolution birthed the M1, and shortly thereafter, the M1A1 Thompson. The M1A1 went a step further by machining the firing pin directly into the face of the bolt, eliminating even more moving parts. The results of this industrial pragmatism were absolutely staggering. Production time was slashed by more than half. The cost of manufacturing a single Thompson plummeted from over $200 to roughly $45. By streamlining the design, Savage Arms and the newly built Auto-Ordnance plant in Bridgeport, Connecticut, were able to implement true assembly line production. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers, taking over the lathes, milling machines, and assembly stations. Raw steel went in one end of the factory, and fully functional, battle-ready submachine guns poured out the other. In the span of just a few years, American factories produced over 1.5 million Thompson submachine guns. It was an overnight transformation of a bespoke gangster rear novelty into a rugged, reliable tool of war that would see action in every theater of the conflict. From the jungles of the Pacific to the frozen forests of the Ardennes. But the Thompson was only half of the small arms miracle. While the submachine gun was being simplified for the front lines, an entirely new weapon was being conceptualized, designed, and mass-produced for the rest of the Army by companies that had never built a firearm in their history. While the frontline infantryman was being equipped with the heavy M1 Garand rifle and the newly simplified Thompson submachine gun, the War Department faced an entirely different logistical nightmare regarding the rest of the military. Modern warfare required a massive logistical tail: truck drivers, radio men, artillery crews, medics, and clerks. These re-echelon and support troops needed a weapon for self-defense. The M1 Garand was too long and heavy for a driver navigating a cramped truck cab, and the standard issue M1911 pistol, while powerful, lacked the range and accuracy required to engage an enemy at a distance. The military needed a light rifle, a weapon that bridged the gap between a pistol and a full-sized battle rifle. It had to be lightweight, compact, easy to use, and chambered in a new intermediate cartridge. Thus began the light rifle program, a frantic search for a design that could arm the thousands of support troops flooding into the military. In a race against time, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company submitted a prototype at the 11th hour. The design was heavily influenced by a brilliant but controversial engineer named David Marshall Williams, who had invented a unique short-stroke gas piston system. Winchester's prototype was incredibly light, weighing barely over 5 pounds, and handled like a dream. The Ordnance Department was immediately impressed, and after a grueling series of tests, the Winchester design was officially adopted as the M1 Carbine. It was exactly what the military wanted, but its adoption created an immediate and seemingly insurmountable problem. The government wanted millions of these carbines, and they wanted them immediately. Winchester, despite being one of the most legendary firearms manufacturers in the world, simply did not have the floor space, the manpower, or the machinery to produce the requested numbers. If the military relied solely on traditional gunmakers, the support troops would go to war empty-handed. What followed is arguably the most remarkable chapter in the history of American wartime manufacturing. The government realized that producing the M1 Carbine required precision engineering and mass assembly, skills that were not exclusive to gunsmiths. They looked toward the civilian industrial sector, specifically the automotive and business machine industries. The Inland Division of General Motors was chosen to be the lead contractor. Inland had vast experience in tooling up for new automotive parts and managing massive supply chains. But Inland was not alone. The government awarded contracts to a bizarre but highly capable coalition of civilian manufacturers. These included IBM, the International Business Machines Corporation; Underwood, a famous typewriter manufacturer; National Postal Meter, which made postage scales; Standard Products, a maker of automotive parts; Quality Hardware; and perhaps most famously, the Rock-Ola Manufacturing Corporation, a company whose peacetime business was building jukeboxes and pinball machines. None of these companies had ever built a lethal weapon. Their workforces were accustomed to assembling typewriters, calculating machines, and steering wheels. Yet, overnight, they were handed the blueprints to a military firearm and told to produce them by the hundreds of thousands. To achieve this, the American industrial base utilized a system of intense decentralization and absolute standardization. No single company made every single part of the M1 carbine. Instead, they acted as massive assembly hubs, surrounded by a web of hundreds of smaller subcontractors. A sewing machine company might stamp out the trigger housings. A jewelry manufacturer might produce the small springs. An appliance factory might forge the barrels. These parts were then shipped to the primary contractors, like IBM or Rock-Ola, for final assembly. This decentralized system could only work if the concept of interchangeable parts was executed flawlessly. The tolerances required were incredibly strict. A bolt manufactured by Underwood in Connecticut had to fit perfectly into a receiver milled by Inland in Ohio, and both had to drop seamlessly into a wooden stock carved by Rock-Ola in Illinois. The Ordnance Department enforced rigid quality control to ensure this interchangeability. When a soldier in the field needed to repair his weapon, he didn't have time to hand-fit a replacement part. It had to work instantly. The typewriter and jukebox mechanics proved that their peacetime experience with precision, gears, and moving parts translated perfectly to firearms. In fact, because they were not bound by the traditional, slower methods of old-world gunsmithing, these civilian companies often pioneered faster, more efficient ways of milling steel and stamping metal, pushing production rates far beyond what traditional arsenals could achieve. The scale of this operation remains difficult to comprehend. From the moment production began in mid-1942, to the end of the war in 1945. This coalition of civilian companies produced over 6 million M1 carbines. It became the single most produced American small arm of World War II, surpassing even the legendary M1 Garand. Inland Division alone produced over 2.5 million units. The speed at which these weapons rolled off the lines meant that not only were American forces fully equipped, but hundreds of thousands of carbines were also supplied to Allied nations and resistance groups across Europe and Asia. The story of the Thompson Submachine Gun and the M1 Carbine is not merely a tale of steel and gunpowder. It is the definitive testament to the sheer, unstoppable force of American industrial mobilization. It is the story of a nation that took one expensive, complex weapon and ruthlessly engineered it for the masses, while simultaneously taking a brand new design and trusting it to the hands of men and women who previously made typewriters and jukeboxes. By combining brilliant mechanical simplification with decentralized civilian-led mass production, the United States achieved the impossible. They did not just win the small arms industrial race, they utterly redefined it, ensuring that every soldier, whether kicking in a door in a French village or driving a supply truck through the Pacific mud, held in their hands a reliable piece of the arsenal of democracy.